and welcome to the meeting of the TEDWIC Mapping Task Group during this year's TEDWIC Workshop weeks. We haven't met for a couple of months now, which is a bit was a bit unfortunate, but I'm glad that we are here, and maybe we can continue on some of the open tasks, and maybe give our new participants, either here live or later in the recording, a chance to catch up and see what the group has been doing. I have the meeting, the minutes for our group, posted them in the chat. So this is our rolling notes document for the group. So we have all of the minutes in one place, and anybody can easily contribute to the meetings. So and today we're going to take a look back on what has happened so far in this group, and also going to give a little view even further back, like how was this group started. I made some quick slides for that. Let me just share them. Most of us here know each other, but for those who don't, quickly, hi, I'm David Fichtmüller. I work at the Botanic Garden and Botanical Museum in Berlin, and I'm the convener of this task group. As for the agenda, to quickly mention, take a look on what has happened so far, and also Matthias has volunteered to talk a bit about the mapping work he and some of the others did in MITS, and how they used the SSSOM standard there. And then maybe we can take a look at the topic we were working on the last time we met, and go back and see, okay, what needs to be done there. So the idea there was to make a survey that we can send to the conveners of the other groups, the standard groups, asking them if they have any mappings for their standards. I know that some do. I know that some of them are a bit hidden and hard to get, and just to get an overview of what is the scope of standards we are currently dealing with in TEDWIC, and then maybe also focus a bit more on then the upcoming steps. And at the end, as part of any other business, I hope that we can either find a date for next meeting, or at least set a rough time frame so we can set up a doodle or something similar to find the next meeting date, so we don't lose the traction that we are having now. As for the history of the group, so during the TEDWIC session in Sofia 2.5 years ago, there was an unconference slot. So this was kind of a 2-hour time slot, I think. And it says, this is for any topics that come up during the meeting. It was scheduled on the last day. And I suggested, let's talk about mappings, because this was a topic that has come up a couple of times during the conference itself. And there was quite a turnout. A lot of people were interested to talk about this, and this kind of how this little group got started. During TEDRIC in Hobart 1.5 years ago, we had a dedicated session regarding mappings with a lot of interesting talks. And then this group was formally formed as a task group under the umbrella of the technical architecture group. And we have worked out a charter for it. And for those who are new and want to participate, we have a dedicated, I have to watch out for the vocabulary here. We have a channel within the TEDRIC Slack space. So if you're part of the TEDx Slack space, you can subscribe to it. And if you're not, maybe some of the others can help me out. Is there like a dedicated link that we can point people to who are interested in participating in the Slack, or is it kind of like invite only and they have to write somebody from the executive to get an invitation?
They have to be added by somebody from the executive who has, or a Slack admin, which
Okay.
I'm not sure who that is, but yeah,
Yeah. So
I'm fairly
yeah,
certain. Need to check.
if if you if anybody's interested, just leave me a note somehow, and I will contact the people who can do that. And
You,
also, we have a GitHub
you,
repository
David,
where
you can, by the way. You
I
have access. You can add people to the channel, by the way.
yet to the channel. But what if the people are not part of the TEDx Slack space?
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other thing. That's true.
That's the issue. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
but there are ways. In general,
Yeah.
it is open for interested people of the community. So,
Yes.
but there's just a bit of a vetting process to sort out any bots or something.
Yeah.
So, which is why it's not open by default. Um, and yeah, we have a GitHub repository, and my goal was to actually post all of the upcoming meetings there as an issue, as a to-do item, so to speak. However, I did not do that for today's meeting. That was kind of forgot this prior to my Easter vacation, so sorry about that. Um, uh, but yeah, I will do better for the upcoming meetings. So if you have a GitHub account, you can just subscribe to that repository, be updated for changes, and then hopefully get a message about upcoming meeting there. As for what has happened in the past year, well, we made some progress, but not as much as I initially hoped, for reasons that I will get into a bit later. Um, uh, so during the last meeting, during the TEDWIC working sessions week, we were putting the finishing touches on the charter. And then I submitted it to the executive committee, and a couple of weeks later, it was approved. So prior to that was like a task group in formation, and now it is officially a task group within official charter. We had the meeting in February, and then another one in July. And I just noticed I forgot to write down the points that we did in July. But yeah, during on the GitHub pages there is a folder for the meeting notes. So all of the minutes are there in Markdown files. And yeah, during the February session, we discussed the charter, and we looked at the use case of triple SOM for the Darwin Core mix mappings. And in July, we started working on on the tasks laid out by the charter, the working plan, in particular the survey. Which brings me, let me just quickly switch back brings me to the charter itself. I thought I just quickly look back at the charter that we wrote. So this is the page on the TEDWIC pages about the communities, and I'm not going to like read the details, but just to get everybody up to the same level here. The goal is just to effectively take a coordinated approach on handling mappings of standards and between standards. So meaning from TEDWIC standards toward outside standards, but also within TEDWIC mappings there. And we kind of chucked out those tasks in, or the general goals into several tasks. So first one is about assessing which mappings are currently used. And then based on that, we want to prepare an overview of what are common mapping practices that's not necessarily limited to the ones currently being used, but also look at other options. And based on that, we will end up with a recommendation for the tag on how TEDWIC standards should model their mappings, preferably in a standardized way, so that the mappings between of the different standards are compatible with each other. And then we have one task, another task regarding the support for standard creators. So the groups that are working on standards, how can they be assisted with coming up with those mappings? And and then one in particular about the recommendation, one important part is that those mappings should be both feasible for human understandings, meaning that it's easy to look up the mappings and comprehend how different terms relate to each other, but also be easily used for machine readability, so that computers also understand those mappings. So just having, I don't know, a PDF file with a table wouldn't be sufficient for that. And then the bottom of the charter document to kind of lay out a bit how this group is going to work and how to get involved. Some of that I already mentioned here, a bit historic context. So much for the summary of the charter. And with that bit of an introduction, I would hand over to Matthias and let him quickly share my screen sharing. Talk a bit about the different mappings that you're dealing with in MIDS.
Yes, thanks, David. I've added a few links already to the agenda. I think this will go on the GitHub repository as well after this meeting, so people who watch the recording can also find them there. The reason that I bring this up here in this group is that we've been using mappings quite intensively for MIDS. They're actually a very critical part of that standard. Because what MIDS is trying to do, so MIDS stands for Minimum Information About Digital Specimen, it's trying to apply a score to each record in terms of how much information is available in that record, information that, according to the MIDS standard, should be digitized for different kinds of specimens. To make that possible, we need to map the different MIDS terms, which you could also see as conditions, to various data standards, because there's some that are commonly used as exchange standards like Darwin Core and ABCD, But MITS should also be able to function at other levels, like even at local collection management systems, which then would require that MITS can be mapped to those data models. To make that work, we need some sort of mapping, actually various mappings, and we've opted to do that through SSOM, as it's a very simple way of doing these kinds of mappings. You could also have a very complicated RDF schema. We started out with a very ad hoc JSON schema. SSOM seemed to us as a more standardized way to go. The downside of that approach is that SSOM, as far as we know, and especially when we get started, has not really seen much practical use yet, operational use at least. So a lot of the things that we did, that we decided, we were just finding out as we went along, which means that it's definitely possible, or maybe even probable, that some ways that we went with you applying the standard are not best practice, could be improved. And as there's currently not really a strict TEDWIC set of guidelines how mappings are supposed to be made, that's, well, would be ideal to have, and that's where this task group comes in. So if you look in the agenda in the document, you will find a link to GitHub, to the MITS repository, where the mappings are going to be stored. Each of the mappings, SSOM mappings, consists of a tab-separated CSV file, which includes the actual mappings, and a YAML file that includes the metadata for the mapping set. I've also included a link to the MITS still in draft website, where the way that we use these mappings, and they are supposed to be formalized, is explained in more detail. I could go into that a bit further, going through that explanation a bit more, just checking if I haven't forgotten anything. No. So if I can find my own link, then I can share my screen. I use this one. Okay. So can you see this?
Yes.
So, okay, this is the mappings explanation page on the MITS website, still in a draft stage. I've made a few tweaks just today, so it's not fully up to date anymore, but most of it still is. So what we have done is we have taken the SSOM standard and set it up for MITS. So we have produced, you can see those files. Let me know if something is not working on the share screen. I think I shared the right window, but you're never sure when you're on Zoom.
Looks good.
So here you have the actual mapping files, which are just spreadsheets effectively, which includes all the information elements and various mappings made for each of those information elements to, in this case, Darwin Core, various terms of that standard. And for each of those links, a predicate, mostly using SCOS, is used to identify the sort of link between those terms. We've done this mainly to be able to specify some simple logic of mapping. So that would be just exact match, but also narrow match, which we use for an OR operator. And we've also set up, you can see those here, another from the OWL vocabulary, intersection of, to be able to specify an AND logic. So that means that multiple properties need to be populated for this condition to return as true. And when you take things simple, that is really the main gist of it. There's of course some additional metadata as well, like the org IDs of the people who worked on it, a date stamp of when the mapping was established, some comments, and in this case, for Darwin Core and for other standards, and that because that's what SSOM supports, we also have a object category. So you have the individual mappings to the elements, the terms themselves, and we also can work on a higher level of the category, which allows us for standard like Darwin Core to also map to extensions. But for more complicated data models, this might prove problematic. So that's something that to investigate in the future as well. What the metadata files look like is like this. So this is one of the YAML files. There's a query map, which is a base thing of a SSM standard, which includes all of the namespaces of the standards that we reuse for making these mappings, and then some metadata variables. Going back to the page here. So the documentation includes some general recommendations as to how multi-value fields using pipes are supposed to be specified, the exact specifications of the TSV file itself, the properties that we recommend or that we require to be present, both in the mapping set and the mappings themselves. And then that's something less important like this for this meeting, is the way that the mappings are supposed to be used and the outcome of them for calculating the MIDS scores. Now, one thing, actually two things that I wanted to highlight a bit further, because they introduce some complications that we might want to think about a bit more, both in the MIDS group and maybe in this group as well. One of them is the object match field. So I said before that we've used OWL intersection of to specify AND relationships, where one MIDS element maps to the combination of two terms in another standard. We use the object match field to make it clear which terms those are in the other standard. So if we're going back to one of the mapping files, we'll find that this is for one example of where object match field is used to specify all of the elements, all of the terms mapped that need to be present for this condition to return true. This is not necessarily best practice according to the SSM standard, but the reality is that we're still not sure, and we haven't really seen how SSM is used in more complicated scenarios in the wild to be sure of this. And that's one open question that I might want to raise in this group. The other one is the regex removal in this case. So this is something that we added to be able to deal with different kinds of null/unknown values. We know those are quite commonly present in data, but the meaning of unknown is not always clear, and we wanted to include a mechanism in MIDS to specify values that we don't accept as actual values representing digitization. Ideally, there'd be best practice and a vocabulary for this sort of thing, of what represents an actual digitized value and what does not. We've made a basic one here, which is mainly always the same terms, including just an empty string. But we have, for instance, in this case, non-acceptable value of 0, which we use for a scientific name ID, because that is the value that GBIF uses in their vocabulary for an unknown name. And we could extend that for different properties as well. So this is the way that we've adopted some of the SSM vocabulary to be able to model this for the MIDS standard. And going back to here, I think those are the main points that I wanted to make. There's one more thing, which is the versioning of the mappings. Currently, we have a few of them. The versioning is not ideal. They're basically updated as we discuss things in the MIDS group and find along things that need to be tweaked. At some point, we will need formal releases, and those mappings will probably need some further updates afterwards. There's been some questions whether we want to include them in the ratified part of the MIDS standard. I think we probably don't want to. We want to make some strong suggestions on which ones to use, but we can expect that there might be more tweaking that needs to happen at some point. But then it becomes very paramount that we have a very strict versioning system of them. And I think that goes beyond the MIDS group. That's something that we also want to think about in the more wider context of, well, what this group is trying to achieve. So I think that's the main things that I wanted to say. Are there any questions or want any clarifications? I'm all ears.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That was a really interesting overview, and I guess a good balance between like going into the details and still keeping it accessible for people who are not as deep into that. So what you mentioned, the versioning, that's actually, I wrote it down because this is a topic that's like really prime for this group here. Saying, okay, coming up with good recommendations as this affects every standard that deals with mappings. But content-wise, I also have a decision. You mentioned some of the things where you just use elements as workarounds to, so the elements where object match field where all of them need to be present for instance, or the regex removal. Are there any things that you wanted to have in there that you were not able to express as part of SSSOM?
Yes. Well, the regex removal currently is not ideal. It's just a tiny set and it could grow very big. We've been thinking about excluding white space. There's also methods for that, but you need to have some sort of formal way to specify that, what gets accepted and what not. And that's something that we have discussed, but we haven't really made it clear. Right now, it's just a pipe delimited string of what's unacceptable, but that could get very big. And if it's actually regular expressions, then I can't really immediately see a use case for that, but it might help, for instance, for trimming white space. Then you'd need a way to have a standard way of expressing regular expressions which differ between different programming languages. So that's also something that could be an obstacle. And the second thing that we have struggled with is the not operator, if we want to put it like that. So we have a use case, this is still something that we're also discussing, where not having a value in a field would still meet the MITS condition. This would be for the property of type status for specimens, because the majority of them don't. So the implication would be that we would only exclude this field, only say have it return negative, if there's a value there that we don't recognize as a valid value. But the complete absence would be acceptable because the vast majority of specimens have that. But that is something that we cannot really do in triple SOM. So that's something that hasn't really come up. And the other complication with, for instance, object match field is that the way we currently do it is that we have that column populated for just one of the mapping relationships, not all of them, because there may also be, they may not be completely separated from each other. There may also be other unions, for instance. And that's why it's only one of them that gets the object match field populated, and there may be overlap for the other elements, which we can include in the definition, but it's a bit of a weird way of specifying it. But that's one of the complications of working with a spreadsheet structure.
Well, see, one of the things I realized when I was doing the iSamples mappings was that I really want a definition in there, just because it made it simpler, sort of cross comparison. You can add custom fields just as triple SOM, and you have to define them in the YAML file. And so we'd have to come up with some sort of way to standardize those things. Definition was an easy one, right? Because it's the same for everything. But there is a way, extension definitions. So I've got slot name, property, type hint for those particular. It's just object definition, subject definition. So it didn't take much of an explanation, right? And I just tied it to Scott's definition. But there is a way to do that. So you could leverage those as long as there was some sort of standardized systematic way of handling these sort of use cases without having to sort of put a square peg in a round hole kind of thing.
Jutta?
I have a question which is related, but maybe it is more MIDS. I don't know. But the mappings actually made me recognize this. If I understand it correctly, so you have one MIDS term and you're mapping several Darwin Core or ABCD terms to it, because if one or all of these terms are present, then there is a mapping and you have a one. So the term is fulfilled. So in I so you actually your MIDS term is not really a term, it's an aggregator in a way. It's an aggregating term. And I find this interesting because it's a mapping from a true semantic term to a container, which I think is okay, but I think we also should be aware of that this is happening. So that was very interesting because I think it broadens the SSSOM application.
Yes,
Is that correct?
Yes.
That the MIDS terms are kind of like containers aggregators?
Well, we had this discussion last year in the meeting with the technical architecture group of TADWIC, and we've also had this discussion in the MIDS group a lot as to what the MIDS terms are actually are. We call them information elements partially because we want to distinguish them from terms, because we want to make it clear that we don't intend MIDS to be used as another exchange standard. The point is not to store your data in the MIDS format.
Okay.
That's not the idea. That's definitely not what we're trying to do, because then we're just building another standard. What we're trying to do with SSSOM is create a method that allows us to have data in a certain standard and automatically and reproducibly calculate a certain score for all of the records that have been modeled in that standard, and make that flexible for other standards, for as many standards as we can, but also keep it easy so it doesn't grow into a very complicated tree that only a very few people can understand. But yes, it's not really terms, but we've struggled with what we actually then want to call them, because it's not really classes either, and all of those labels, they have connotations that may confuse people who are used to working with them in a different context.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. So I'm happy to know I understood it correctly. So,
Yeah. And to come back to what Ben mentioned about extending the SSSOM, well, in this case, the mapping set to include more columns, more properties in the actual mapping. We've already done that to some extent by the regex removal. So I'll share just for a bit again. So this is one of the example YAML files, and we have used object preprocessing in this case and specified regex removal. But in principle, this could become more. This could also be an array of sorts, if we can model that, where a different sort of preprocessing is applied, which includes trimming white space and things like that. But this is also something that's a bit hacky, and we definitely would like to have a more formal, standardized approach to this.
I thought SSSOM allows you to have arrays for which to check. In the example, there are arrays. It's not very formalized, but I thought it was there. So
yes, well, the query map in the mapping set is an array, so that's something that we could do. And I think that Ben, in the examples that he's done with the extension, that's also an array, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just gonna have a look.
With that one right there.
Yes, I think that was actually the exact, no, not the exact one that I had open, but we opened that one. So yes, but already there's a few different ways of doing it. So I think it would be very, very helpful if we could come up with a standardized way of doing this for different standards. And as we have that, we're all working on that, then we can see the different issues that abound and try to address them, because I'm sure there will be some. But right now, and that's also something that came up with, Ben has done a lot of work on the MIDS website, and how do we want to present these mappings and how do they relate to the different other parts of the standard. That's something new. It was done for Latimer Core, but for Latimer Core the mappings were much less critical and much less profound than they are for MIDS. So we had to sort of improvise quite a lot of things to find a way that we wanted to present them.
The big way was that is in Latimer Core, I initially had all the mappings on a separate page, and that didn't make sense because it was taken out of context. So it was hard to sort of see how they were useful. But in MIDS, you do want them on a separate page. You actually want them on both. And so they're linked back and forth. So you've got each below each information element, you have the mappings and it links over to the bigger table, which then has a drop down, which gives you all kinds of more information about it.
Yeah, maybe we can take a look at that now.
Sure.
I do have the links, but just would be helpful to have a common look. John, is your hand related to that, or is it something?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I wanted to put on the chat, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
These aren't necessarily for discussion, but might be useful. There are two concepts that are coming out in the biodiversity data quality standard proposal. One is about empty and not empty. So I put a link in there for the definition for that. And the other that was interesting based on what Matthias was saying was what an information element is there. So I'm curious, not for discussion here, but I'm really curious about the higher level mapping between MIDS as a test suite and the biodiversity data quality standards as a standard, and where those meet or what can be used from one to the other. So thank you.
So from my point of view, I think there should be quite a lot of complementarity, maybe even overlap between them, because in a way what MIDS does is close to an is empty check of various kinds of fields identified in the mapping. So this could be attached to the whole process of how we use the SSSM mappings in the MIDS calculation. If the is empty check in the is if the definition of that check aligns with what we're trying to do in MIDS, which is actually still a bit up for discussion, the whole unknown vocabulary issue is not fully resolved, then that part could be done by the data quality group. That would be ideal. What I don't know right now is exactly how those checks in the data quality group work. I haven't used them in practice.
What I see as an opportunity would be to define a MIDS, one or more MIDS use cases, which define the set of tests that need to be done, validation or issue checking tests, and then add to those measures. There's a measure type test as well, which can give you a score. One of the outputs can be a score. So you could define a MIDS use case, MIDS level 1 use case, define which tests had to be run in it, and define a measure which would return the MIDS score, all within that framework. So it could be really interesting to try and do that, or at least to consider it when BDQ hits the public review, which would be soon.
So then that would mean that we have to identify from all the checks in the data quality, is that just also a sort of standard, the BDQ, in if it gets ratified, or
Yeah, it would be a standard unto itself
Yeah.
with several namespaces, but the basic one would be called BDQ Core, and that would consist right now of 110 different tests,
Yeah.
many of which you're going to want or already have somehow. But these would be formalized, they'd be based on an ontology underneath, etc.
Well, we'd want some of them, but not all, because what MITS is trying to do
Clearly.
is identify the digitization level and not the quality of the data. So checks that are more about data quality, like validation checks on georeferenced data and things like that, would not be in scope. But things like is empty and checks for white space or checks for characters that are more or likely meaningless, like just quotation marks with nothing else. Those things would be useful to have formalized and that we can just reuse. That would be very helpful.
Right, right. So the question would be how much is already there and what would be missing? And it could be that a way forward would be to use BDQ as the platform for defining the MIDS use cases and just say, here are the tests for MIDS level 1. Here are the tests for MIDS level 2. And here's the outcome of a measure that has to be satisfied. And in other words, to me, it's not a question necessarily of biodiversity data quality. It's a test of your expectations or needs against what's actually there and reporting that. So to me, the framework works perfectly for MIDS. It's a matter of whether all the tests you need are actually defined yet. But anyway, don't want to derail a mappings task group meeting for that.
No, but it is quite interesting. I'm just trying to wrap my head around how the actual mappings would work in this framework. I think they would sit with this sort of triple SOM setup. So you'd first do the mappings and you'd use those to then apply some of the checks of BDQ, and then you get your results. But I'm not sure if the triple SOM step could be further incorporated into the BDQ framework.
It's not set up for it now. The tests, at least in everything that was defined right now, the scope was to define them against Darwin Core terms. So if you've got the mapping, that's a necessary previous step. Yep.
Yeah. So that was what I suspected. But yeah, it's okay. So what I think we should do, and that's something to raise in the MIDS group later on then, is to look through all of these tests. Those are all on the
I can give you a better link. There's a quick reference guide to the tests themselves, and that's the easiest. Give me 1 second to get that. Yeah, so that link is the temporary home for the period of the review. Eventually, if it gets ratified, it'll have a different home. But this is what will go to public review.
Okay, I'll make a note of that and put it as an agenda point for the next MIDS meeting. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure the BDQ group would be curious about anything that's missing or anything that is different.
Well, it's interesting that you raised that because last week there were already some questions in these working sessions about unknown vocabularies and a standardized way of dealing with missing data, null data, suspected missing data. And this also extends to BDQ, obviously, and it was definitely an issue for MIDS because we wanted to avoid those spurious MIDS results. I'm not aware of to what extent this was discussed in BDQ. I know there
It was
were
discussed in one very specific instance, not as a general problem.
Yeah. So maybe that sort of discussion might not be in the scope of this mapping task group, I guess. But it is a general problem for
Yeah,
at least if you want to address it across TEDWIC, or at least some of TEDWIC standards, then it becomes a
yeah.
wider issue.
It touches the mapping topics and as far as the interconnection, if I understood this correctly, would be the like attaching the BDQ tests to the triple SOM like pre-processing or elements. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, we'd expect that the mappings would have to be done before the tests could be run.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the tests would be included somehow in the mapping or in the mapping set. Yeah, that would.
There,
Go ahead.
there are in triple SOM there are terms that could actually work where the BDQ elements could live. So there's mapping tool and there's curation rule. So that is kind of like where I would think that is for having scripts or having high-level rules. So without having done it, but I can see how the BDQs might be used either before a mapping by removing all the white space or checking that it's not a specific term, because then things don't work. And then also doing the mapping, saying, if you have this regex, if you have this term, then we have a mapping. And if we don't, then not. And if BDQ defines these checks, that would be really neat.
So that's what's currently sort of there. I used object preprocessing from the mapping set vocabulary of triple SOM, specified that to be regex removal, and then I include the regex to remove in the data file of the mappings itself. And then, for instance, there is a proof of concept tool. I presented that more about in the MIDS session last week, the MIDS calculator, which uses the mapping to calculate the MIDS scores, and that incorporates those regex removal as a step. So that happens before you do the actual calculation. You do the pre-processing on the values. But in this case, this is an ad hoc setup. If we can work with the BDQ, then you could just have somewhere in the mappings. I'm not exactly sure currently where that would reside and how that we would model that, but I think that could be figured out. Would just be a list of BDQ tests that need to be applied before actually calculating MIDS.
So you could have a reference of a rule, a BDQ test set by URI, and develop a term that's sort of pre-processing process URI, and that references, and you have those BDQ tests defined in some sort of standardized format. Is that possible, John, given the current architecture?
Not sure I understand how it would work.
So you bin together a set of tests and reference those tests by URI. So you've got a set of tests that you're going to run as part of MIDS, and that you, instead of sort of trying to do this concatenated list of things, you reference a set of BDQ tests by URI, and you do it that way from the mapping file.
Yeah, so that you would do by setting, it would be called a use case. You'd
Okay, well,
say,
that's it.
here's a MIDS level 1 use case. And that's basically a little bit of metadata around the list of tests to run.
Okay.
Or the list of tests that need to return valid or valid after amendment results in order to pass. So there's this idea that a normal workflow would be assess, that is, do your validations. And then for those that come up with a result that's not compliant, you see if you can amend it with what's there. And that would be the corollary amendment test, which proposes an amendment. It doesn't change any original data. It's never supposed to. It's supposed to say, if I were to change this, and if you trusted me, given the information that you gave me, this is what it ought to be. And then you could apply the test before and after and say, here's what kind of improvement could be done if you chose to do so automatically, because it's the tests already have implemented in them how to fix the data that are received. So you could do 3 steps, say, basically validation, amendment, post-amendment validation.
But then regex removal would be separate. Let's say you wanted to map 2 columns. One of the columns had the qualified term, so it's got the namespace colon term. The next one has just the term. So regex removal example here would be, in order to map column 1 to 2, you have to remove the namespace prefix in front of the term, then it matches to each other as a regex removal. That would not be in the test. That would be a separate thing, correct? Sort of a
No.
pre-processing.
Yeah, because you have to align with Darwin
Yeah.
Core to do the
Okay.
test.
Yeah, and one other complication, so maybe I'll find my proper window, and I don't know which one it is. Anyway, if you look at one example, TSV, and look at the regex removal column, it's a pipe separated list, but one of the reasons that this is set up like this is that we want to make it possible for people who make new mappings, for instance, to their model in their own system, their own database or what else, and extend them, because they might know that there are values in their system which are not representative of actually digitized data, and they have placeholder values like s.l. s.c. And this is an easy way of including those as needed in a new mapping set. I'm not sure that sort of thing would be easy to implement in BDQ.
No, I don't think it would.
No, so that is, unless there is like, yeah, a test for basically regex removal in BDQ, but I guess that won't be there.
You could define the test. It won't be there, but you could define the test.
Yeah.
So the envisioned process for the evolution of BDQ is that a set of core tests will be part of the body of what gets ratified. And along with that is all the history of the 11 years of doing this to get to this point, plus supplementary tests that have been worked on but not implemented for various reasons. Many reasons that they could be not implemented. So there are a bunch of those. One could take those supplementary ones as the groundwork for a proposal for a new term. It'd be like in Darwin Core, you propose a new term, this would be a new test. It's a little bit more of an effort to get a new test adopted because you actually have to create an implementation. So that means that you provide some validation data that have to run through an implementation and provide the expected results, where the expected results are part of the definition of their test. So it could be done. Any test could be done. It just has to be well described. It has to have well-described inputs and outputs and what to do if certain conditions aren't met. Like there can be internal prerequisites that aren't met because data are missing, or it can be external prerequisites aren't met because there's no vocabulary available, it's not accessible in those cases where a control vocabulary needs to be accessed, things like that. So within the test, there's no restriction on what it's capable of doing, nor even the number of information elements involved. That's all wide open. But it's not there. What you're describing isn't there.
Oh, and I'd have to take a look exactly how these tests, these implementations are set up, because I don't really know that right now.
Well,
So
it
you,
certainly is an interesting topic that is, yeah, also intersecting with this group. But maybe I would suggest that you go into the details of the actual specifics in the dedicated MIDS sessions. But once you've got something, please report back and give a summary here within that group, because that will certainly be useful for other groups as well.
so pivoting back, I think what we could do today is say that that TADWIG mappings in TADWIG should adhere to the triple SOM specification, and just put that forward as this is the specification that we support and adopt for publishing mappings between vocabularies.
Yeah, let me table that thought for just a moment.
Sure.
I want to give Jutta the word for now.
Yes, yes.
I think I have a response to that actually, or that is my question. I would like to pick your brains about the balance between use case driven and like a theory driven approach, because what we currently are doing, it's mostly use case driven. And that is kind of like, Ben, what I see you are proposing is like, oh, we all use triple SSM, so why not make it general and say that's our standard? I kind of feel, I think, so recently I said to somebody, I think use case driven is a really good approach when you already have a larger framework and you checked your framework and you understand kind of like the environment and the landscape that you are hanging all your use cases into. And then use cases are great, but I feel we are kind of like poking still a bit in the fog and we don't really understand our whatever parameter space or our universe that we are working in. So I wanted to pick your brains about this.
Can you maybe give an example of what you mean by use case driven mappings?
Yeah, like we like in Latimer Core, we jumped in and started mappings. MIDS is picked up and expanded on this. You had the use case of building web pages and you
Yeah, right.
added to it. So it's all kind of like application, like implementation driven kind of thing, need driven. And it's not like taking a step back and thinking about what are we actually doing here? What kind of like, what are we actually dealing with?
So I do think the triple SOM would be the standard for reporting these things. The procedure and use case is a bit different. Like, because I think MIDS has got a different one. When I did iSamples, I had a whole different approach where instead of they're pretty different standards, and instead of the initial mappings were done by someone who did term by term without paying attention to class. And those were good, but they were off because without the class context, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially like XSD standards, right? It's just the whole thing is class-based. So the way I did it was I did a different approach and did classes first. And then if your class is mapped, like if Darwin Core event mapped to, vocabulary 2 event, then only the properties that belong to Darwin Core event can map to properties within the vocabulary 2 event. Otherwise, you can't take something from one class and map it to the other. It doesn't work. So it puts a boundary on those mappings, but that's a procedure. I don't know how globally applicable that might be, but it's still, but both MIDs in that approach and all of them still can be reported as triple SOM. But how you present them is a different sort of story. That's true. That like I'm not sure what the right approach. The presentation aspect is always a big question, right? How do you present these things in a way that people can easily understand them and how you're reporting them? But the structure and the information, that's my only suggestion about triple SOM is that it's the globally applicable way to sort of structure and report this information into CSV files. How you present it is something different. Does that make sense? And I think the presentation is going to depend on the use case, because one way it might be they're both triple SOM, but one way we might present it this way, another way we might present it this way, but the core files are still in triple SOM. So it makes it easier to sort of present them in different ways too.
So I understand that different visualizations, presentations make sense. What I kind of think is so triple SOM has kind of domains and ranges where you can say, what are these terms actually? Yeah. So what are the structures that the terms are embedded in, and how do they influence the mapping? And that would actually be something general that I would be interested in. Do we understand how that works? We are moving towards structure. So how do the mappings actually work for us in these structures? And you found a solution that is like a use case based, but it's not, it's not checking if that would also work for Latimer Core or for MIDS with its weird container terms, or what would be the boundaries of when it wouldn't work. What if you have networks? So I'm just like, but so this kind of like taking a step back, because triple SOM is actually really powerful. And for me, it would make sense to check. So we have this very powerful standard which not only maps one step, but it actually thinks about when you map term A to term 2 and then term 2 to term 3, do 1 and 3 map. So they also think about these kind of things. So like you map Darwin Core to Latimer Core and Latimer Core to MIDS, that does then MIDS also map to the Darwin Core term. We are starting to get into these kind of like realms of complexity. So, I would feel more comfortable to check these kind of things.
Jutta, I have the feeling that I understand what you mean, and I feel similarly like torn between the two like approaches, suggestions given by the two of you. And so when we set out this group and like sketched the first version of the charter, their goal was, okay, like get an understanding of what's out there. And when we had this first impromptu meeting 2.5 years ago, it was like I had heard triple SOM at some point, and I know that's like a way to map things, but I hadn't had any real contact with that. And it was like, yeah, that could be potentially, but maybe there are others that I just haven't heard of, or just that see how the individual standards do that. So I know that for the ABCD we have some columns where we put just the mappings in there that are like not properly published, and also need to review in itself because some of them might be quite outdated. I know that Darwin Core is having that field ABCD equivalence also for historic reason, which was used to be like really hidden away. Now it's part of the website rendering. But that's same issues, also a bit outdated, and has some room for improvement. Then that there's the classic RDF mappings, just having like the 3 columns, like subject, predicate, object, and so the goal was just to see, okay, what is out there, what is currently being used, and then the first 2 steps task of the chart are just doing this like proper field analysis. But since then, like the landscape has changed a bit in terms of the triple SOM has become just a lot more prominent, and this I'm not quite sure whether this is something because just the standard itself is gaining traction, or just like my personal visibility of that standard has gained traction because it just happened to be adopted in a couple of standards that are related to my reach of noticeability, and so I have the feeling that the standard has gotten more prominent, but this could be an illusion. And on the one hand, I do want to do this like proper like analysis of what's out there, and then we can then say with a certain confidence that okay, we are making here a recommendation that is the best that we are aware of with a certain certainty. Yeah. So we can say with confidence that we've looked around and that's the best. But on the other hand, like that will take some time, and this group is just not really moving, and like primarily caused by me. But just saying, okay, we have something that is kind of prominent within different standards where we already have existing solutions, where we have ways to render the mappings, where we have certain experience in the field, something that is probably able to cover most of the things we want to cover. That there might still be issues. So my default example is for the mappings between ABCD and Darwin Core, the higher taxonomy. So if you want to have like a Darwin Core family, you need to go in ABCD, the higher taxonomy, and then go take the element higher taxon name, where the corresponding higher taxon rank is familia. That's Latin term. So, and this is so far in the mappings of between ABCD and Darwin Core, this is kind of like written in text, readable for human, but not machine readable. And this is certainly something that we need to find a solution, a workaround, something that we might need to come up with our own like additional columns to declare something like that. But yeah, we and at the same time, I know this is going to be an issue, but I'm fairly confident that there's no other standard out there for documenting mappings that's going to be anywhere as practical. So yeah, I'm also torn between this. Should we do like a proper landscape analysis, or should we go the pragmatic fast route and selecting the one that's most likely going to be the best contender anyway, judging by my limited current understanding of the field. So sorry, that was a bit of a long monologue, but
no, that's great.
Your discussion perfectly captured what my internal thoughts on that process and that I had in the last half year. Matthias, you raised your hand.
Yes. So my immediate thought was trying to think of how you would model this in triple SOM. The example that you just gave with ABCD and Darwin Core with taxon rank needed, so an additional check. I don't know immediately whether it's possible, might not be. I think what would be interesting for this group is to try and play around with it, maybe find some feedback as to how this could be done. That would be indeed sort of at least gunning for triple SOM initially as a sort of thing to work with. And it's definitely possible that there are better frameworks out there. I do
also
just
zeroed into triple SOM. So yeah.
Yeah, I do think that from a task group point of view, I think it's very nice to have these sort of early results, and it's something that you could also build on later on. So I would try and see how far you could push the simple framework of triple SOM and see if it gets you where you want to be, because you also don't want to just do things more complicated just to be more complicated. That also comes with its baggage and cost, which might not be needed. I think the whole triple SOM thing is a nice parallel to why Darwin Core was so successful, because it's simple, because the data is in a format that most people can easily understand. And if you want to do things more complicated, you might want to, then you immediately raise some complication that dramatically reduces human readability. That's already a trade-off that I would be very mindful of when trying to do this work. You could, why make it more complicated if you can do it simple? So that's why I would argue for that approach. See how far that can get you. Also because it's a very concrete deliverable / report that this task group could work on with, I think, very useful results for the whole TADWI community.
Yeah.
I can see as I say, I think it's a balance, and you cannot go completely the abstract way. But I also question that you can go completely the use case way. Both has its advantages, and to approach the question from maybe a bit a different perspective is, I have the feeling the biodiversity standards, TEDWIG standards are maturing. They're getting better and better, and they are also expanding. There are more and more extensions and associated standards. So my impression is that the questions get more and more professional. They're not about the simple cases anymore. It's about, can you map a term to a class? Can you map a term to a condition? I need to have a class, or like I need to have two terms in this kind of way, and all these kind of like it's a professional settings where it's about real world applications that are always complex. And my impression is that we are kind of like currently as a community hitting a boundary where it's not, it doesn't seem to be a good idea, or we are hitting a limit of what we currently can do. And maybe we need to consider, I don't think currently we don't have the resources to actually move from like fragmented, oh, I am able to do that, I'm able to that, to something that is actually cohesive and considers all the standards and provides a full professional approach. And if that is the case, if we are really starting to be dealing with a very mature standards environments, then might be a question to how do we solve this resource limitation? What is our future in 10 years? Where will we be? David.
Yeah, John, you raised your hand prior to that.
I took it down because I'm not sure how I want to form the observation. So go ahead, keep going.
Okay. Yeah. No. There's. Yeah. You raised some like quite large scale questions there. As yeah, I also don't know what the best approach is. Going back to Matthias' comment of like, yeah, triple SOM is the Darwin core of the mapping standard that yeah, brought the thought to my mind, and like, okay, if that's Darwin core, then what is the ABCD of the mapping standard, the overly complicated with a lot of historic baggage that is able to do like the niche use cases that are not covered by triple SOM, and whether there's a comparable standard there. But yeah, I maybe this is, I mean, I do have to take the current time in consideration now, and it's I really think it's an interesting and fruitful discussion here. So I'm not yeah, I'm glad we had this discussion here, and it's not a big issue that we are not getting into the question of preparing the survey a bit further. But yeah, maybe this is something that should also like feed into the survey. So the idea is that, okay, we are not going to go on the we are just going for triple SOM just now route, but also doing the survey and then specifically asking people whether they have any experience with that or whether they know particularly any other ones that we need to just also consider, and if they are aware of certain use cases like the higher taxon mappings that are not possible or are tricky with triple SOM. So like actively looking for reasons not to do that switch, and probably there won't be any objections in that regard, and that kind of makes the second step of then going for the recommendation for triple SOM a bit easier, and then at the same time kind of make sure that we did at least a bit of looking around, even though it's not as as open-minded as we had written it in the charter. Would that be a compromise for those two approaches?
I think so.
I think it would. I mean, basically, we need to try it to know.
Yeah.
And we've got at least one very good situation or one good use case, which is MIDS. MIDS needs to do this.
Yeah. And
do we have others?
And if we do recognize things that are not possible with the current setting, then it might be useful just to say, okay, then we define our own ways of handling those special situations. When if the opportunity would have been just to say, okay, now there's no standard that matches all our mappings, so we need to come up with our own system. So we might as well just reuse the bulk of the work and then take care of the extra cases. Jutta?
Well, an alternative would be to contact the people hinter and triple SOM, because it seems to be still actively developed web pages, completely rewritten, and say, hey, we have this specific situation. How would you suggest either we do it, or is there an expansion to triple SOM, and have the standard expanded? So, I mean, yeah.
Certainly, yes. I also had that in my mind for the next step, coming up with our own solution and feeding that back into that community. So yeah. Okay. Matthias?
Yes, I wanted to get back to what John just said. We have a use case for MIDS, and I think I'm not that close to the process, but I think another good use case will be in the future a Darwin Core data package, because that's going to be quite a revolutionary change to a lot of the workflows that people have built around Darwin Core throughout the years. So lots of people are going to have to redo the mappings that they have made to Darwin Core data package. And that could be something where this group could actively contribute to.
Yeah, good point. And we want to have like a recommendation in place before people actually start doing that. And before everybody start doing their own approach. John?
Definitely. So what I would like to see as a useful outcome would be, could you take an SSOM mapping and create an implementation from it automatically that took a Darwin Core archive and created a Darwin Core data package? So we've already done the mappings ourselves to try and understand things that are different. And most of it is straightforward, but not all of it is straightforward. And what do you do with a basis of record, which has no meaning any longer in the Darwin Core data package? So there are things like that. It would be a really nice test if you could go from SSOM to directly to software that could create one from the other.
I think the trick is going to be having, when you have close matches, when there needs to be some sort of decision made, right? So like you might have a close match, but so it doesn't, you can't do it automatically. So you need to go in there and sort of manually sort of curate that mapping. That could create complications. Does that make sense?
Exactly.
So yeah.
Exactly. And how much of that, I mean, we would discover categories of things that were non-trivial. But could there be solutions to those non-trivial things, like pointing at software implementation or at pseudocode or something that could turn information elements, not just single ones, but information elements, groups of fields, let's say, in one to the other unambiguously. And after that, is there still stuff that could not be done automatically? That kind of research would be immensely useful, I think.
So another use case I did do is iSamples has vocabularies, enumerations, and the triple SOM has some rules governing what properties can map to, what classes can map to, and what values can map to. And so values have to map to classes. It's a class to value mapping only. You can't do properties. And so I've got a bunch of vocabularies that were mapped to Darwin Core classes. So there's another sort of, it was pretty straightforward to do. But there's reasons why you can't only do, I can't remember what they call it, triple SOM, but there's rules governing that kind of stuff.
Jutta?
Related different question. Are we actually planning to have a mapping repository? So if everyone is now starting to do mappings, are we going to have like one central place where we collect all the mappings? Or will they be distributed among the different TEDWIG standards or extensions or use cases?
I think currently what Ben sort of has been working on is a standardized way of providing the mappings in GitHub repositories. So that's something that could be built upon. A standardized way where mappings always can be found in the GitHub repository.
That sort of stems from static gen, sort of backtracked, and when I pull them out, where they go and how they're named and things like that. Slowly working on it as a natural,
And I'd say probably the better approach would be to have a mapping registry. And just saying, okay, here we have a mapping standard, and that mapping sits over there. So the mapping creators are free to do updates as they see fit, and you don't run the risk of having different versions at different places. But yeah, having something like that would be useful. That one approach would be just seeing how that is going to develop. The Hannah presented during the Hobart TEDWIG conference during the mapping session there, a tool that like the people in Finland are working on, or they are planning on working on, on a really like early stage for mapping registry. So that would certainly be, if it like turns out the way she presented it, would be like a good place to say like, okay, there's no need in coming up with our own. Just we recommend that people use that place, and I don't know, maybe they have a way of tagging like all of the TEDWIG related ones, and so it would be a good place, something like that. But
there was a class in SSSM called Mapping Registry for this particular purpose.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, SSSM, they themselves have mapping registry. I saw it also when I opened up my session
below
here.
that, they even have mapping sets, so you can say this is how Latimer Core mapped it, this is how MITS is mapping it, this is how people do it from Darwin Core archives to the new packages. So yeah, so there's at least 2-3 layers to it.
Yeah. So that is certainly something we need to discuss at a later session, like which ones are there, which one can we recommend. But this goes more into like the task number 4, like the support for standard creators, like how to register mappings, things like that. But yeah, that will certainly be a topic of this group at some point. We are already a bit over time. I would like to ask here, since we are not as many people as have registered, there are 9 more people who did register for the session but didn't turn up. I think it's probably better to make a doodle for next meeting, and my idea was maybe at some point in the beginning of June, and by then have the survey like pretty much ready, so we can everybody gets a look, and then have like all of the extra work for like setting up the form. I don't know whether SurveyMonkey or something like that, or Google Forms, and there's no need to have all of the people looking at one person filling out the fields. But before we send it out, just have people look over it again and make finishing touches there. And I thought maybe like 6 weeks, something like that, would be useful. But I think Doodle should be the best, but like all of you who are here, we might as well just look into our calendars to identify certain spots that would work well for you. So those that are here are in an advantage for being able to be at that date.
June is fine for me.
Early June, first 2 weeks in June, me too.
So yeah, the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th would like work well for me, preferably.
Not on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are hard.
Not. Oh,
never
mind. That's June. That's fine.
But yeah, in general, okay. Yeah, then I think we identified a good spot, and I will prepare a doodle and send it around. But yeah, good to know that like none of you have like any big conferences or something like that in that week that I was not aware of. All right, then thank you all for being here. I think we can stop the recording now.
Yes.